Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to a coastline that is cold, foggy, and just inconvenient enough to make everyone slightly miserable. So go ahead and dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, preferably one not made of damp wool, because that was very much the Viking vibe. We're heading to North America, but not the one with Thanksgiving and powdered wigs. No, we're going earlier. About 500 years earlier, before Columbus got lost with confidence, before Jamestown tried to survive on vibes alone. Tonight, we're talking about first contact. Specifically, what happened when a group of extremely stubborn Scandinavians, fresh from chopping wood, arguing about honor, and inventing creative insults, ran into the indigenous peoples of North America. And as you might expect, it did not begin with a trust fall. Now let's gently row our longship back to the year 986. Over in Greenland, which, despite the optimistic branding, is mostly ice and existential dread, lived a man named Eric the Red. Eric had been exiled from Iceland for, murder, which in Viking society was less of a scandal and more of a scheduling issue. So he sailed west and discovered Greenland. I say discovered because, as always, someone was already there. But for Eric, it was new enough. He named it Greenland because Vikings understood marketing. If you call a frozen rock ice hell, no one moves there. But Greenland, suddenly it sounds like a spa retreat. People came, they farmed, they struggled. They tried very hard to grow barley in a place that did not want barley. And eventually, the population grew enough that Eric's son, Leif Erikson, decided that what Greenland really needed was even more west. Because of course he did. Around the year 1000, Leif sailed further west and landed somewhere along the coast of what is now eastern Canada. Archaeologists today point to L'Anse aux Meadows as the likely site. Imagine it, wooden buildings, iron nails, a forge, Vikings hammering away in a land filled with unfamiliar trees and wildlife. It must have felt promising. They called the region Vinland, possibly because they found wild grapes, or possibly because Vikings would name anything after alcohol-adjacent plants. Now here's where it gets delicate, because North America was not empty. The Norse sagas mentioned the people they encountered. They called them Skraelings. It was not a compliment. The word roughly implies something like weaklings or barbarians, which is bold, coming from people who thought axe duels were a reasonable hobby. The indigenous peoples of the region, likely ancestors of the Beothuk or Dorset cultures, had their own lives, networks, and systems. They had been there for thousands of years. They understood the land in ways the Norse absolutely did not. And at first, contact may have been cautious but not violent. The sagas describe trade. Red cloth was especially popular. Imagine a Viking holding up bright wool fabric like a medieval QVC host. In exchange, the Norse received animal pelts. For a brief moment, it worked. But here's the thing about first contact. It is fragile and full of misunderstandings. One saga tells of a bull, because there is always a bull in stories like this. The Norse had livestock. The indigenous people had never seen a large, snorting European bull before. When the animal charged and bellowed, it reportedly frightened the locals, who retreated. Now, imagine being startled by a giant horned creature you've never encountered. That's fair. But fear breeds suspicion. Suspicion breeds tension. And tension in frontier zones rarely resolves itself with polite dialogue. The sagas describe skirmishes, arrows flying, Norse shields raised, small-scale violence, nothing like the massive colonial wars that would come centuries later, but enough to make settlement uncomfortable. And Vikings, for all their dramatic reputations, were practical. They were outnumbered. This was not England, where they could raid monasteries and sail home. This was an enormous continent, vast forests, unknown populations, no reinforcements within easy reach. Greenland was already a logistical headache. Vinland was an even bigger one. So they left. Not in a blaze of glory, not in some last stand against overwhelming odds, just quietly packing up, realizing that maybe farming in icy Greenland was actually the safer option, which is saying something. Now, let's slow down and look at this moment.
This was likely the first known encounter between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of North America, 5 centuries before Columbus. And it didn't turn into conquest. Why? Because the Norse weren't backed by large states hungry for empire. They were small settlements clinging to survival. They didn't have the population numbers. They didn't have the disease advantage fully in motion yet. They didn't have supply chains pumping in settlers. It was a toe dipped into the Atlantic world, not a tidal wave. And from the indigenous perspective, these newcomers were strange, but not world-ending. Just another unfamiliar group appearing on the horizon, possibly aggressive, possibly temporary. Which, in this case, they were. The sagas, like Saga of the Greenlanders and Saga of Eric the Red, tell the story with their usual mix of pride and understatement. There's no grand moral, no sense that they missed out on ruling a continent. It's more like, well, we tried. It was cold. People shot arrows at us. Let's go home. And that's kind of refreshing. Now let's float gently into the bigger picture. Contact zones are complicated. They are spaces where languages don't align, where gestures mean different things, where one group sees trade opportunity and another sees potential threat. Neither side fully understood each other's social structures. The Norse had chieftains, thing assemblies, and a deep belief in personal honor. The indigenous groups had their own political systems, alliances, and territorial understandings. Imagine trying to negotiate land use when one culture sees land as communal and spiritually embedded, and the other sees it as something you can claim by building a hall and saying, "Mine now." It's awkward, and awkward can turn dangerous. But here's something interesting. The Norse sagas mention a woman named Freydis, sister of Leif Erikson. She reportedly faced down attackers by grabbing a sword and, in one dramatic version, baring her chest to frighten them. Now, is that historically precise? Hard to say. The sagas were written down centuries later. They liked a good story. But even if exaggerated, it hints at something important. The encounters were intense enough to become legend, yet still limited. There was no sweeping conquest, no mass displacement triggered by Viking expansion, just a brief, uneasy experiment. Archaeology backs this up. The site at Lonso Meadows shows a short-term settlement, maybe a few years, maybe a decade at most, then silence. Grass grows over the foundations, iron rusts, stories drift back across the Atlantic. And for centuries, that was it. Europe forgot Vinland. Indigenous histories continued, as they always had, centered on their own networks and conflicts and innovations. The Vikings became mythic figures in sagas, not empire builders in America. It's almost peaceful in a strange way, a collision that didn't spiral into total transformation, a meeting that flared, then faded. Now, that doesn't mean it was harmonious. There was violence, there was fear, there were likely casualties on both sides, but it remained small, contained. And sometimes history turns on scale. Had the Norse arrived with thousands? Had Greenland been warmer, more stable? Had Europe been in a different political phase, maybe the story shifts. But they didn't. So Vinland became a footnote, until modern archaeology dusted it off and said, actually, they were here, which quietly rearranged the timeline of European contact with the Americas. And tonight, as we let this long ship drift back toward Greenland's icy shore, it's worth noticing how different this first contact was from what would come later. No grand manifest destiny, no sprawling colonies, just a handful of weary sailors testing the edge of a continent and deciding, very calmly, that it wasn't worth the trouble. And sometimes, in history, the quiet retreats are just as fascinating as the loud invasions. So take a slow breath. Imagine the fog settling over the North Atlantic, the long ships turning east, the indigenous hunters watching from the tree line as the strangers disappear beyond the horizon. No treaties signed, no flags planted permanently, just memory and story. And that's where we'll gently pause for now. When you're ready, we'll continue drifting deeper into the layered, complicated world of early Atlantic encounters.